I'm Stuart Neild. This is Politics Congleton, in depth. And on this edition, we talk to the Deputy Leader of Cheshire East, Craig Browne. Now, today on the show, we've got a special guest. It's a good special guest, this one. It's Craig Browne, and he's the Deputy Leader of Cheshire East. A very busy man, so thanks for taking the time, Craig, to come and talk to us on Congleton Radio.
Absolute pleasure, Stuart. Good to be here.
Now, we're talking about politics. This is obviously the politics show. So we'll start off. I've got a few questions for you, and I'm sure you'll answer them.
I'm looking forward to them, I think.
I'll tell you what, though, that's rare. It's rare that you get someone... It's easy to get the people that aren't in power, but when it's the people that are in power, it's very hard to get them to come on and talk. But like I said, the ones that are trying to get in power, it's easy because it's like, obviously they're just going to have a rant and a moan.
Yeah, I think really I've got a responsibility to come on and try to explain things. I know that people won't always agree with what I'm going to say, but I will always try to explain things in the best way that I can to try and help people make sense of them and understand them.
Well, that's good to hear. Now, I've got to ask you this first. Now, I've heard you say before that council resources are stretched. But how about all the COVID funding from central government? Haven't you done well out of that?
I think there is this perception, isn't there, that all local authorities did very well during the pandemic out of COVID-related funding. Firstly, it's true that over the 2-year period from the first lockdown, the council received just short of £380 million. So that sounds like a lot of money, doesn't it? But, this is a big but, at least 90% of that wasn't for Cheshire East Council. We just passported nearly 340 million of it to external bodies. So we were effectively an unpaid grant provider to business. Effectively, our role was to passport the business support grants to those organisations that were affected by the restrictions. And so, in actual fact, only 10% of that figure was for the council itself. And this was to help with the costs of what the government called new burdens. So additional costs that we were facing as a council as a result of the pandemic. For example, helping to make our buildings COVID safe, helping to support the test and trace programme, but also to help cover lost income. If you think most people were working from home, so there was nobody using our car parks, nobody paying parking charges, and there was nobody using our leisure centres either. We're still having to pay rates on the buildings, still having to pay the staff salaries, of course, but there was no income coming in to cover any of those costs. So that's why the government did support us. But as I say, only 10% of what the council received did it actually get to keep.
So that that lost income from car parks and stuff like that. That's kind of like a grant there for you. All these grants that were going out of a local level. I know there's businesses in Congleton that had grants, and that's all been paid. The government's paid that to you, and then you've paid those businesses.
That's absolutely right. As I say, the vast majority, at least 90%, of the funding we received, we passported straight on to those businesses that were eligible to get the support grants.
Now, I've got to ask you this one. What's your response to the accusations that Cheshire East has been building up a slush fund, keeping money in reserve?
I think it makes sense for any organisation to have a little bit in reserve, clearly. I think it's important to just remember that the current administration inherited reserves of about £10 million. Now, to most people, £10 million probably sounds like a lot of money, doesn't it? But if I could just put it in context for your listeners, the Congleton Link Road cost £90 million to build. So in that kind of context, £10 million isn't a lot of money. through careful budgeting, we've managed to increase that £10 million reserve over the last 3 years to about £12.5 million. But again, to put that in some kind of context, our annual running costs as an organisation are over £300 million. So we're only actually holding about 4% of our annual running costs in reserve, or to put it another way, just 2 weeks running costs for the organisation. Now, most people, I would think, consider that it's sensible to keep a little bit back for a rainy day. And, of course, it could be that that rainy day is just around the corner. Councils are subject to the same financial pressures that everybody else is currently subject to. We're also seeing that dramatic increase in energy costs. For example, people still want to visit our libraries and our leisure centres. Just think about how much energy it takes to heat a swimming pool. And also construction inflation is running currently about 20% annually. So on a major scheme like the Poynton Relief Road, that equates to an extra £6 million of pressure. So basically, whilst £12.5 million may sound like a lot of money, our reserves could be wiped out on a single project. So I do think it makes sense for us to try where we're able to put that little bit by, so that when an emergency situation does come along, we're better placed to be able to respond to it.
Well, that seems fair enough. So it doesn't do any harm, does it? Saving for a rainy day, as you say. But the things that you do spend, people seem to point out, they always complain that it's always Crewe and Macclesfield rather than Congleton or places across the borough that get the money spent on them.
Sure. So it's true that we're spending an extra £25 million in Crewe at the moment. But again, I think it's absolutely vital to explain that that is money that has been awarded to the council by the government. The government set up a scheme called the Towns Fund, and it's based on the deprivation indices. So, for example, Crewe has 6 wards that are in the top 10% most deprived nationally. And that's the basis on which Crewe has received, or should I say Cheshire East has received £25 million from government on Crewe's behalf. It's money that wouldn't have been available to other areas in the borough. So it's funding those regeneration projects that it's supposed to fund, projects like the Market Hall and the redevelopment of the bus station in Crewe. And I think also, if we look at what's already happened in other parts of the borough, Alderley Edge has had its bypass, Congleton has had its link road, and it's getting a new leisure centre. Poynton is getting its new relief road, that's due for completion at the end of this year. Middlewich is going to be getting a new bypass. So actually, surely it's time some money got spent in Crewe, because that's what levelling up's supposed to be about.
Well, let me get this right. I'm just getting my head round it. Basically, we've got the Conservatives at a local level moaning that money is being spent in Crewe. Apart from the ones, any Conservatives in Crewe won't be moaning about that. But I mean, in the other areas, they're moaning about that. But basically, it's their own government's policy, and it's their own government that's give the money for do that.
I won't comment on the Conservatives locally, but this is money that is being provided by a Conservative central government, which is ring-fenced to spend in Crewe. Right,
I understand that. And I hope our listeners do. So, anyway, here's one that's always said, or has been said, it was only said the other week, that if you vote for the independents, you'll get Labour. How do you feel about that? Do you think that's the case?
Well, of course, I would say if you vote independent, then you get independent. Now, we're investing an extra £90 million in highways repairs over the next 3 years, and that was actually our idea. Labour had the highways portfolio for 2 years before we introduced the committee system. They didn't make this investment, and the Conservatives didn't do it before them either. So that's a very clear indication of something that the independents are delivering in the administration. And it's interesting that the Conservatives actually voted against that investment at our budget meeting. But also, it's independents who changed the SADPD. Sorry for the acronym. That's basically Local Plan Part 2. We took out some of those sites that the previous administration had put in the Greenbelt. So we returned the Greenbelt to the Greenbelt effectively. It's been the independents who've had the finance portfolio. We've delivered that 4-year balanced budget for the first time in Cheshire East history. We voted actually to retain a tip in Congleton. We introduced the FlexiLink bus service that's been, prior to the pandemic, been really, really successful, demand responsive transport service. It's the independents who made that financial commitment to redevelop Congleton Leisure Centre. And of course, it's been the independents who delivered that change in governance, which we all felt was so absolutely fundamental and necessary at Cheshire East in 2019.
The independents, though, did not stop Congleton Tip from closing. Why is that?
I think, first of all, we did vote the decision came to Cabinet and we did vote to keep it open. But it's, again, really important for your listeners to understand that the lease on that site was signed by the previous administration, by the Conservatives, and they knew that it was going to expire in 2021, but they made no alternative provision for it. Contrary to what I have heard them say, they didn't put any money in the budget. They've talked about £4 million, but actually what they did was they created something called a capital addendum, which is basically a shopping list of capital items, but for which they don't have any money actually available. It's kind of like a list of nice to haves if you win the lottery.
Which is fair enough. We all want to win the lottery, don't we?
Well, absolutely. It's fair enough, but actually it's not a spending commitment. It's, yes, we'd like to do this in a very ideal world that, clearly none of us inhabit.
But why have you increased council tax by so much? And why does it always seem, as like residents of Congleton, that we get less in return?
Yeah, so I do understand the perception, but actually we haven't increased council tax by anywhere near as much as the previous administration. So between 2015 and 2019, they actually increased council tax by 19%. Since 2019, we've increased council tax by 15%, with a projected increase for 2023-24 of just 1.99%. So independents have actually cost less than the Conservatives running the council. I think it's also important to just remember that the Conservatives were responsible for the biggest annual rise that Cheshire East has ever seen. That was 5.99% in 2018-19. And also to remember, that was at a time when CPI inflation was just 2.5%. That's less than a third of where it is now. And also don't forget, back in 2015, Cheshire East Council was still receiving £56.9 million from central government through something called the Revenue Support Grant. Now, that £56.9 million had fallen to £5.4 million by 2018-19, and by 2019-20, when the current administration started running the council, we've actually been receiving no revenue support grant at all. And we received the lowest level of government settlement per head of population compared to any of our neighbours. So actually, we have run this council incredibly efficiently.
How would you respond to the challenge that you are spending less and less on road maintenance then?
Well, we're not actually spending less, but the government is certainly giving us less. Our highways asset, I'll use the word asset, I could say liability, in fact, is valued at a replacement cost of £6 billion. This year, we received just £15 million from the DFT for road maintenance. Last year, we also received £15 million, and the year before that, we received £19 million. So 2 years ago, we had just over a 20% cut in the money we received from government for road maintenance. So just again to put that in some kind of context, as a percentage of that £6 billion asset, 15 million is a quarter of 1%. That's like asking you to run a £10,000 car with 25 quid a year. At that rate of investment, it will take 400 years to fix our roads. So we're investing an extra 19 million over the next 3 years, but the council's having to borrow in order to do that. And again, I think it's just worth remembering the Conservatives voted against that because they voted against our budget. They clearly thought we could borrow without paying it back through council tax.
Well, one of the independents, Councillor Rob Morton, he runs a lot of the Facebook groups where it's potholes in Congleton and stuff like that. And in all fairness, he does seem to have done a lot of work bringing attention of potholes in Congleton.
I'm sure Rob's been doing an amazing job on that. I know that he's a very hard-working local ward councillor, and he draws, and that's what ward councillors should be doing. They shouldn't be sitting in council chambers scoring political points over each other. They should be on the streets working for their residents, saying to officers, here are the issues in my ward, develop those relationships with the officers, work with them. Then there's a chance that you'll get the work done in your ward.
Now, I've talked to a lot of councillors of various parties, and the feedback that they come back to me, if you're mentioned, it's quite good feedback that you do listen to other parties, that you work with other parties.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's at a personal level. I just hear good things about you.
Well, that's a nice compliment. Thank you, Stuart. I mean, we always try to do this. Back in 2019, when we were faced with a decision that we didn't anticipate, we didn't really want to choose between whether we were going to work with Conservative or Labour, but they both made it clear to us that they weren't prepared to work with each other. So we were forced into making a decision. We had to work with one of them.
I know Robert Douglas, when I've had him on the shows before, and he always says, oh yeah, you can work with Craig. And Robert, of course, as you know, is a Lib Dem, but, you know, when he's gone to you, he's obviously been pleased that you've listened, even if you've not agreed, but he's been pleased that there's been that cooperation.
As I said right at the start of this conversation, Stuart, I feel I have a responsibility to try and explain to people just why things are the way they are. An awful lot of people who've never worked in local government. I was in this position, 7-8 years ago before I became a councillor. I'd worked in the civil service, but for nearly 20 years I'd run my own business. And you don't have that appreciation of how process-driven, how procedure-driven local authorities actually are. And I think part of my role is to help try and explain that to residents and help them to understand it. They won't always like it, and they won't always agree, and I understand that, but I'll try and explain why it is how it is. But absolutely, the politics is irrelevant. I will work with anybody and everybody. If they're respectful and polite to me, I will always do the same in return. What
do you think is going to happen in May 2023? Do you think you're still going to be working with Labour?
Well, firstly, I have to say all bets are off in that regard. We worked with Labour in 2019 because first of all, as I've just said, Labour and Conservative both made it clear they weren't going to work with each other. So some kind of multi-party administration just wasn't going to be possible. That's a shame. We would have liked that, but that was their decision. So we were forced to make a choice, and we decided to go with Labour because we recognised that change was necessary, and we think the result that the residents and the voters of Cheshire East delivered in 2019 reinforced that message that change was needed. But after next May, we might just as easily be working with the Conservatives. For us, it's not a question of left or right, red or blue. As I just said, the politics is irrelevant. Frankly, they're both as bad as each other because they will both put tribal party interest first, always. That's kind of in the DNA. That's why they are parties. Whereas independents are always going to put their communities first, and that is why I expect next May that more independents will be elected. Interesting, I don't know whether you were aware of this, but this May 2022, nationally, just over 3,000 independents were elected as councillors. That's more than any other political group.
So there's a real growth there, isn't there? I didn't know that. I didn't know that there was that many.
I think one of the things that we're lacking is a national spokesperson, a go-to. So after the elections in May, all the national party leaders were interviewed on the national tea time evening news. But the independents don't have that national go-to person. So I think probably for that reason, most people wouldn't have been aware that 3,064 independent councillors were elected last May.
Do you think the independents' success comes from the fact that they've no party whip?
I think this is absolutely critical to who the independents are and how we work. Yes, there is a polite request and an expectation that you support other ward members if on an issue, if that issue is not detrimental to your ward. But if it is detrimental to your ward, clearly you are there as an independent and you are there to represent your residents in the best way that you can. And I think the way that we've done this, and we must be doing something right, because if you look back to the 2019 election, there were 34 members of the Conservative group elected at that time. 4 of them have subsequently left. 3 of those 4 have joined the independent group. So for them, they clearly didn't mind that we were working with Labour, but they respected the way that we work in the absence of a whip.
Well, that's the thing. You've had quite a few defections to the independents, haven't you?
We have, and we don't just let anybody in. We clearly have a conversation with them and try and understand what their motivation is and what they would be seeking to achieve by joining the independents and what they would like to do within their own wards. But clearly they respect the fact that we don't have a whip, and I think that many of them have said they find that quite refreshing.
What do you make of politics at national level, though?
This is an interesting question, isn't it? I think if the last few months have shown anything at all, it's that what Westminster is crying out for is an independent conscience. Because we've got to this situation, it doesn't seem to matter anymore how bad one side is, provided they can point at the other side and say, well, you're worse. And I just think what an indictment of British politics today that is. It's almost become a race to the bottom. And surely we need and deserve better than that. Now, I don't know what the solution is, other than getting some independents elected to Westminster, but I do know that this situation that we're currently in and have been in for the last few months with all that's been going on is damaging to our reputation, both nationally and internationally as a country.
What do you think of the Conservative leadership election then? You must have some thoughts on that.
Well, firstly, it does concern me that the next Prime Minister is going to be chosen by just a couple of 100,000 party members. And to me, this feels like an incredibly small electoral college to be making such an important decision. And I would say I kind of feel sorry for the party membership in a way, because it feels to me as though they've been left with a choice between bad and badder. Now, I followed every leadership election since about 1990, when I was first starting to develop political conscience when I was at school. And I can honestly say I've never been less engaged, either by the process or by the two candidates. I mean, for example, they've both come out and they've stated that controlling immigration will be a top priority for them. Really? I mean, with everything going on in our country today, and internationally as well, is that really the most pressing concern?
Yeah, like you say, when there's all the problems with poverty, it's just like the same old that they're coming out with. It
is, and as I say, I've listened to many leadership debates. Not this time, I have to say. I've become very disengaged with it. But previous leadership elections, and we hear the same thing. We hear that they're going to put more teachers in our schools and they're going to put more bobbies on the beat. And when do we ever see it? When do we ever see it implemented and become the reality?
What was rather interesting was, when they've been voting with the members of the Conservative Party and asking their opinions on polls, they've wanted neither of these leaders, and they just wanted Boris Johnson. They would rather have him in charge than the two that they're going to end up voting for proper.
Well, this is, as I say, it feels I do have a little bit of sympathy for the Conservative Party membership nationwide, because they do seem to have been left with a choice between bad and badder. I believe that for this to have been run in a more democratic way, firstly, not the wider membership, because I think that a Prime Minister should be elected by the whole country, not just by a couple of 100,000 members, but I think they should have been able to choose between the 7 or 8 candidates that entered this process at the beginning, not just the last 2 that the MPs thought they liked the look of.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that a lot of it is just run by the 1922 committee, and they've got, a massive amount of power. It's them that got rid of, they put Boris in as the Tory leader. Obviously, he got him elected. But as soon as they're fed up with him, it's that 1922 committee that's more or less ousted him.
Well, this is it again. I know we often look across the pond at the American system and aren't necessarily particularly enthralled with how it works, but at least they have the primaries. At least they have those nationwide elections where the leader of the party is chosen. The 1922 committee seems an even smaller electoral college to be choosing the Prime Minister from. I just think the system quite clearly is in need of a rethink and an overhaul.
Yeah, I'm amazed. It's like, we're getting Prime Ministers that the public hasn't voted in.
This is it, exactly.
Yeah, so our Prime Minister's leaving when the public hasn't voted for him to leave. It's sheer madness, really. But let's have a think of some of the main issues that the country will be facing today. What do you think about their main issues? What would you do if you were in power?
Well, firstly, on the question of what the issues are, clearly we've got the war in Ukraine, which might well spill over into a major international conflict. We've got the Chinese saber rattling over Taiwan, and it does feel a little bit, I have to say, like a major showdown between liberal democracy and authoritarianism on the other hand is coming. That's just on the international stage. At home, clearly we've got the cost of living crisis. We've potentially got an energy crisis coming this winter. We've got a shortage of labour and skills. For example, we see this as a council. We've not got enough drivers. We've not got enough people to drive our bin wagons. We're hearing now that there aren't enough train drivers to run the railways. We've got tailbacks at our major port terminals. We've just had the pandemic, and then, as I say, we've got candidates for Prime Minister currently who think the answer to those things lies in curbing immigration. And it's so far removed from reality, I just find it deeply concerning, to be honest.
I only found out today, because my daughter's got a new puppy, but she's had trouble finding a vet. And, the normal vets that we go, they said they can't take anymore because they've got a shortage of vets working for them.
We're seeing it in different sectors across the entire country. I think the ones that are most prominent at the moment, clearly, as I've mentioned, are we haven't got enough drivers. We haven't got enough trained HGV drivers. We haven't got enough train drivers. We're learning that in order to run a 7-day train service, that can only happen if people are prepared to work overtime. I mean, that is just crazy in itself. But you're right, veterinary surgeons, highly qualified people, and we need more of them. Doctors the same.
And dentists. See, there's a shortage of dentists as well.
Yes, that just reminded me I need to book my next checkup.
I mean, the thing is, a few years ago, we'd have thought this was impossible.
We would, and I have to be honest, I don't know what the solutions are. Clearly, I'm not an MP, and I don't speak for any of the national political parties. That again, is one of the advantages, I suppose you would say, of being independent. But one thing I do know is that in a time of both national and international crisis, the solution does not lie in isolationism. And I just don't believe that this is a time, if ever there was a time, to be turning our backs on our closest international neighbours. The cost of living crisis isn't going to be helped by doing things that put prices up, like raising tariff barriers or increasing regulation or basically making trade with our neighbours more difficult than it needs to be. These are really exactly the actions that are going to make goods and services more expensive. And as I said before, I'm feeling a bit fed up, and I'm sure residents are as well, as hearing the same promises from MPs, prime ministers about more teachers in schools, more police on streets, and none of it ever seems to happen.
I mean, I've got to admit, I was just asking you those questions about national politics. It was just a bonus, really. But you've really come across as statesman-like, almost like a prime minister in waiting.
I'm not sure about that, Stuart, but thank you for the compliment, I think.
Yeah, I think it's been a more grown-up politics than what we've seen played out on the television.
Well, as I say, I think I've watched one of the leadership debates, and it has just left me feeling disengaged with the whole process, I have to say. For somebody like me who doesn't have a strong allegiance to any political party, I would say that the person or the people that are seeking to become Prime Minister have a problem if people like me don't think they are speaking to me. If the messages that I'm listening to from the current leadership debates just don't resonate with me as being of a priority importance, put it that way.
All these issues that we've talked about, if you were Prime Minister, how do you think you would resolve them?
Gosh, now you're asking me. I'm a local councillor, Stuart.
Yeah. I'm throwing you to the lions here.
Yeah, you are on that one, I'm afraid. I mean, as I say, I do think that the answer doesn't lie in isolationism. So I think we need, with the way the world is going at the moment, and a major international conflict may not be very far away. I hope to God that isn't the case, clearly, but it might be. What we need in the current climate is more cooperation with our neighbours, and more cooperation with those countries who share our values. That's certainly the first thing. In terms of the energy crisis, yes, I do believe that. I mean, I read an article over the course of the weekend about the bonuses that chief executives of utility companies were being paid, and it's staggering. And the profits that they're returning. I'm a free marketeer. Don't get me wrong. I have no objection to companies exist to make a profit. I understand that. But when I see these pretty obscene levels of profit, at the same time as you've got people who are really living hand to mouth, struggling already to put food on the table and to heat their homes, and that's even before we've got the onset of this winter, I think we've got a major crisis coming.
Well, it's not just the working classes that are being hit, it's also the middle classes, the ones that run your cafes and bars and stuff like that. They're actually closing down because people can't afford to go in.
They are, and at the same time, those small business owners are also facing hugely increased energy costs to keep their businesses open. They're having to pay more to get their goods brought in. Their supply chain is taking longer and is costing more because we've got ferries stuck at terminals and tailbacks on the motorway because, or we're waiting for deliveries because we haven't got enough drivers. So all these things are, if you take them one by one, they maybe don't sound as though they're a huge issue, but the cumulative impact of them is going to be massive.
Well, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today, Craig. We really do appreciate it.
My pleasure, Stuart.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.